Temple University. This is Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with authors and illustrators prominent in American literature for children. The moderator for this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter, Professor of Children's Literature with Temple University.
Welcome to Profiles in Literature. Our guest today from upstate New York is the Newbery Medal winner, Emily Cheney Neville. In order to be with us, she had to give up some very demanding work in Albany. What are you doing there?
I'm at law school, Albany Law School.
Our hats are off to you for even attempting this.
Well, it's rather a wild venture, I think. I'm not sure how it'll work out.
What year are you in?
Second. Well, I think I will now make it, which was in doubt for a while. Whether I will then pass the bar exam is still very doubtful. And I don't know.
We're glad you could make it, and joining me in this cheering section are Mrs. Carolyn Field, coordinator of the Office on Work with Children of the Free Library of Philadelphia, my collaborator in the Profiles in Literature series, and Dr. Ann Roos, my colleague, professor of children's literature at Temple University. We want to thank you for giving Temple a plug in your book, Fogarty, by listing Dan Fogarty as a Temple University graduate. Tell us where you heard about this university.
Well, I heard about it from my oldest daughter, who graduated from Temple about, well, I better not name a year because I don't remember. It was about 5 years ago. It was about the time I was writing the book. So it was a name that, a college that popped into my head at that point.
I thought maybe you heard about it because you yourself were a college student in this area, weren't you?
That's right. I went to Bryn Mawr, which is out half an hour outside.
And what did you study there?
Economics. As far as, you know, sort of going back to the law school thing, I think I've probably done these two things to some extent all my life. I was interested in history and economics, which is akin to law, in college, and then I really hadn't done anything more with it. I was raising a family and writing books after that.
Well, moving from economics to law is logical, but in between you showed tremendous prowess as a writer by earning no less than the Newbery Medal. We have the Newbery Medal here, and we want to get a close-up shot of that. You got it in 1964 for what book?
It's Like This Cat.
Has that ever been dramatized in film?
I don't think so, no. No. There's a record, sort of a dramatized recording, but I don't think, and there may have been a little TV spot in New York once, but there's never been any real film of it, no.
Well, we're going to have the opportunity now of appreciating Miss Neville's writing style by seeing a dramatized episode from It's Like This Cat. Teenagers Dave and Mary have kept a date at Coney Island on a chilly day, and now Mary brings Dave to her home for the first time.
Nina! Hi, Nina. I brought a friend home. I thought we'd have some cocoa. Boy, it's freezing outside. Oh, Nina Davy. This is my mother.
How do you do?
Hello. There's coffee on the table.
I thought we'd have the cocoa.
All right.
No, thank you.
Tell me, are you in school with Mary?
No, I live in Manhattan. Well, I met Mary this summer when I was on the beach with Cat, my pet.
What do you read? In school, I mean.
Well, last week we read The Highwayman and The Wreck of the Hespers. Well, they're about, well, I mean, we were studying metaphors and similes. Looking out over the ocean today, I can sure see what Longfellow meant about the
Don't you read any real poetry? Donne. Auden. Baudelaire.
We didn't get to them yet.
Schools.
Don't mind Mother. She just can't get used to New York schools. Or Coney Island, or hardly anything around here. She grew up on the left bank in Paris. Her father was an artist and her mother was a writer, so they taught her to read at home. Starting with Chaucer, probably. You know, she never even read a kid's book in her life. Anything I ever tell her about school sounds either childish or stupid to her. You know what I like the best? Science. You know, experiments and stuff. But she can't see that for beans.
Well, our science teacher's a dope, so I never really got very interested in science. But I told Mom and Dad that I was coming to the aquarium today to take notes, just so they wouldn't kick up a fuss.
You know, we ought to get our mothers together. Mine thinks I'm wasting my time if I even go to the aquarium. But I do, though, all the time. I love the walrus.
What does your pop do?
Father? He teaches philosophy at Brooklyn College, so I get it from both sides. Just think, think, think. You know, Father and Nina aren't hardly even interested in food. Well, every once in a while, Nina will spend all day and cook up some great fish soup or chicken and wine. But usually I'm the only one to take time off from thinking to make a hamburger. They live on coffee and rolls and sardines.
What do you know, a record player in the kitchen.
Yes, I sit down here and eat and play records while I do my homework.
Do you have any Belafonte records?
Yes, a couple. But why don't we listen to some of this?
Well, that's nice. What is that?
It's called the Moldau. That's a river in Europe. It was written by a Czech named Smetana.
You know what would be fun? To be out in the harbor today in a boat, if you didn't sink.
We could take the Staten Island ferry.
Really? Well, where do you get it?
Down on 69th Street and 4th Avenue. It's quite a ways. I've usually gone there in a car. But we could take bikes, if we don't freeze.
Well, we won't freeze, but what about bikes?
Well, you can use my brother's. He's away at college now. And you can use this old jacket of his. Nina! Nina, we thought we'd take our bikes and go over to Staten Island on the ferry.
Oh?
Well, we thought with the wind blowing and all, it would be exciting.
I see. Well, enjoy yourselves.
Mary and Dave enjoy Staten Island. She seems to be the first date Dave is comfortable with because she doesn't giggle and is willing to pay her own way. Theirs becomes a continuing friendship at that tender boy discovers girl stage in a sensitive book with a big city setting. What were you thinking when you saw that, Miss Neville?
Hard to say. I think probably, you know, you hear music you're familiar with, and it really rings a bell. It reminds you of a lot of scenes and places. As far as the book goes, well, it goes to show that in a way a dramatization is very different than how you think a thing as you're writing it. And by that I don't mean to criticize the dramatization. It was fine, but, you know, I have different feelings.
Mm-hmm. Was It's Like This Cat your first book?
Yes, it was.
And tell us in some detail how it developed.
Well, I started writing it because I had a market in mind. I was trying to write a story to sell to the New York Sunday Mirror, a tabloid newspaper, and they ran a short story complete on this page every Sunday. And I'd sent that editor one previous story, which he was sort of interested in, and said, have you got anything else? So I wanted to write something that had a New York setting and was a sort of colloquial. The Mirror is, you know, a tabloid newspaper. It's not a highly intellectual paper. Well, I got started writing this argument of a kid arguing with his father, and the kid telling it. I had not before that ever written anything in the first person. I'd been fooling around with short stories and different things, but I'd never written anything in the first person with somebody different telling it. And I started off with this argument, and I just was having a good time writing it as dialogue, as a funny scene. So I thought, what would they argue about? And I thought, well, he could want to. The father tells him how great it is to have a dog, so the kid will want to get a cat. And then I got that far and thought, okay, I've got a boy and a cat and a father. What is going to happen, or what does happen to cats? Well, I thought what had happened to our cat, which was only two things, really, that like everybody's cat, he occasionally got lost, and that he had jumped out of the car on the parkway. Those were my only two really close connections with cats. The characters in the book, like old Kate, I had a babysitter who came to my house at one point who was a real cat nut and a cottage cheese and no string beans nut. And so those things came directly from that. She eventually began bringing her sick cats when she came to work, and we parted company at that point. So writing the book was really from then on a matter of keeping on adding another incident, another location, another person. I did not have the slightest idea of a real plot in mind when I started. The original story out of which the book grew had Kate and the cat jumping out of the car, and then they all came back to New York, and it was just a short story. So it went along in little expansions, chapter by chapter. I mean, I roped in Inwood Park and downtown and the Fulton Fish Market and Coney Island as I was trying to think of other things that a kid would do. And then the last third of the book was written somewhat separately when I got up to 9th grade. And obviously he would meet some new friends. At that point I realized that almost all of my children were all in school in New York City at that time, almost all their friends were Jewish, and that, I hadn't mentioned any friend who was Jewish or anything, and that was a good, colorful episode. Incidentally, a school outside of Philadelphia here did a musical 2 or 3 years ago in which that Rosh Hashanah scene was terrific. It was a largely Jewish community in the school here, and they really got into it, and they were had this big colorful dance at the Fulton Fish Market on Rosh Hashanah. It was a really nice scene.
It was fictional.
Yeah, they added at that point a great deal to the book very well.
Wanted to ask you if an editor helped you in the writing of the book.
Yeah, the editor helped a great deal. As I say, in all these expansions, little by little. I think I first sent it to Harper's. Well, I first showed them the short story when I went in to see the editor about something else. And she said, yeah, that if you could expand that might make a book, because I would like books for older boys, for the 12-year-old stage. And I sent it back to Harper's, Ursula Nordstrom, 2 or 3 or 4 times in the course of the book, and roughly speaking, they said, fine, but keep going. It's not long enough, it's not a book yet. And then there were some suggestions they made after we'd signed a contract. It was really after we'd signed a contract that they said, we got to the plot, finally, in a sense that you need a little more thread to tie this all together. And your thread appears to be the boy and his father, so simply strengthen that a tiny bit and make sure that that's where you end. That's where you began, so end with boy and father, where I had previously ended with the incident with Kate and the kitten.
And Tom was inserted to show that the father could be a decent human being to a stranger, right?
No, Tom was inserted for the purpose of getting the cat out of the locked cage in the cellar, back in chapter 2.
Which developed him.
Yeah, and when I first wrote that, Tom was a burglar, being a professional type burglar.
Yeah.
And when I got into making it into a book, I realized that my acquaintance with professional burglars was fortunately 0, and that I better get on ground where I was a little bit surer, because I really depend very much on knowing all about any character I put in. I mean, that I know people like that. So I put in a college kid because I know what they might think or do or whatever.
You're on firm ground.
Yeah.
I think we ought to show some of the editions of It's Like This Cat. This one is the American edition. And will you please identify the other editions?
This one is Czechoslovak, which is rather rare, probably, and has very amusing illustrations. I don't know whether you can tell from the cover, and, well, you can see the great cat with a sort of a satiric grin on his face, but they're very amusing illustrations. Now, I may make a mistake. I think that's Finnish, but I really go by the publishers, and I think that's the Finnish edition. The Scandinavian countries are the biggest on reprints. That's the Danish one of Barry's Goodman, and that is the German, no, that's the Danish of It's Like This Cat. Young in New York is the either Swedish or Finnish. I'm sorry, my
All of us will know
acquaintance with
this
these. And C'est la vie, mon vieux chat is the French.
Mrs. Neville, in all your books, you do so much with dialogue. You seem to enjoy writing it, and it certainly is alive and realistic. Have you ever thought of writing for the theater, writing plays?
Yep, I have thought about it, and there's one big drawback: plot.
Oh.
You really have to have a tight plot to make a play work. And anybody who had written screenplay, who took one of my books, would have to insert some plot, because mine is a little loose. I did think about it on 17th Street Gang, which would make a good little play, but there are some fuzzy areas in the plot there.
Well, now with so much going on television, and the television people looking for plays to produce, it seemed like it might be ideal, particularly where you are so good at dialogue. I noticed at one time you said something about children should be read to. Now, this is one of my great philosophies, too. What do you mean by what should they be read to, and when?
Anything and everything that both parties enjoy. I don't, I mean, you know, I think the adults should enjoy it too. Don't read something that drives you up the wall, because it comes across that you don't like this book. Whereas, I mean, you know, I've refused to read comic books to my kids just because I couldn't get any fun out of reading it. I didn't mind their reading them to themselves.
Well, so many people feel that only the young children should be read to. Did you ever do any family reading in your home with the different age levels? And
as a child myself, I was lucky. I was read to long after I could read, when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old. My father used to read aloud, my mother used to read aloud. The nurse that I've mentioned in Traveler from a Small Kingdom read to us a great deal. With my kids, I copped out on the whole sooner than that, in that I probably stopped reading to them as a whole once they were, you know, 3rd grade age, when they could read themselves. Except on special occasions or now and again. Now and again as adults, we read a little bit of something that one of us is reading.
I read someplace where I think you're kind of a sportswoman, and I read that you like to swim in icy water and that you are very interested in fly fishing. Is this true?
Well, where I've lived in the summertime, the water is icy, so if you want to swim, that's the kind of water you swim in, and you get used to it, and I don't mind it. I don't mind warmer water, too.
But I'm really interested in the fly catching.
Fly fishing, well, I did a lot of fly fishing with my husband, and he made a lot out of what a great fly fisherman I was. I'm not that great. I managed to be able to get the fly out and catch a few fish.
Did you tie your own flies?
Occasionally. And we went together. It was what he liked to do, and it was good, good fun.
I would like to ask you, this is kind of a two-pronged question, I guess, and it's especially about Barry's Goodman, because I read Barry's Goodman after I read It's Like This Cat. And you said that almost all the characters that you write about, you have someone in mind.
No, I didn't say that.
Oh, I thought you said...
It's definitely not true. The reverse. what I did say is that I couldn't write about a character that I didn't know someone in that position, in that general walk of life.
All right.
But I definitely avoid having a particular person I know in mind.
How about locations? Is this the same thing with locations?
Yeah, locations even more so, that I really have to have been there.
The reason I asked is because the house is so, in Barry's Goodman, the house that they buy in the country, is so specifically spelled out, and especially the bathroom where the mother hides out from the family. And I just wondered if that had any kind of a personal reference or not, knowing that you had children.
It was kind of two houses put together. Barry's Goodman in general started from a little bit from experiences of a friend of mine who did move to the suburbs and did start selling real estate. And I used to talk to her about this as we played golf occasionally. And she'd be telling me about all these houses she was trying to sell and buyers. Well, and she lived with her 4 children, and she really hated living in the suburbs with her children. Well, some of that house is patterned, or in my mind was her house. But I had another friend out here in Wayne, Pennsylvania, that I visited about in there, who had a child's bedroom up a separate staircase from the kitchen. It wasn't a bathroom, but it was a whole little separate room that was sort of over the kitchen on its own stairway. So I put those two together. And that's how a lot of writing is done. You pluck something from one area and add a detail from somewhere entirely different.
What inspired you to do Barry's Goodman?
Well, it grew out, and again, I started trying to write this as a grown-up short story in some ways. I tried it in a lot of, which if anybody wants to write, they should remember. Try in a lot of different ways: poem, fiction, narrative, essay, first-person, detective story. There may be lots of more ways than one to skin this cat. It grew out of my just talking with her, and she mentioned the problem selling real estate, of the restrictions understood by all the real estate brokers. Don't sell north of Broad Street to anybody who is Jewish, which left you in the uncomfortable position of fishing around to see whether this or that buyer was Jewish or not. And since many of the buyers were her friends who came out from New York, and many of them were Jewish, she was very uncomfortable about the whole thing. So I was trying to get that situation into some book, and Barry's was what it wound up in.
Well, you mentioned earlier the book that tells the most about your own childhood, the autobiography of your childhood, Traveler from a Small Kingdom. I wonder if you would tell us briefly about the place, the Cheney family lifestyle there, and the high school named for your father in Manchester, Connecticut.
Well, the place was probably nothing like this exists right now. It really is of an earlier day. First place, Manchester was what you would call a company town. The Cheneys ran the industry which employed probably more than half the people in the town. And they happened, the Cheneys, my grandfather and his brother, happened to have a lot of children. One of them had 12, the other one had 11. And they more or less all settled right there in Manchester, Connecticut. So it was an area perhaps the size of a small golf course. And they dotted their 10 or 15 houses about it with roads snaking in and out, not city grid roads. And there we all grew up, and we did not tend to go out of that boundary much. We went, for some time, I went to school there just with my cousins, and I really hardly ever knew any other children or played with other children outside of my cousins until I was 11 years old and went to school in 7th grade. My father worked in the silk mill. My father had gone to law school early in his life and then got the measles and affected his eyes, and he couldn't do the reading. So his father said, well, all right, enough of that nonsense, go into the family business, which is what he'd wanted him to do all along. So he went in the family business, which he didn't particularly like, but stuck with it most of his life, and interested himself mainly in his work on the Manchester Board of Education, which he worked on for 30 years or so. And that is the reason for their naming. He really sort of began technical vocational education in Connecticut, or in Manchester, Connecticut. I think it was the first school in Connecticut of a technical nature, and it cooperated with the silk mill. But of course now the school that is named for him is a very technical, expert mechanics, electronics, all kinds of things.
You and your 6 brothers and sisters led a relatively sheltered childhood,
Yeah.
so that when you were age 12 and had to cook your first dinner with your sister Mary, it was a disaster, which you eloquently described. As a result, have you taught your own 5 children to cook at an earlier age?
Oh, yes. Actually, I knew how to cook, but the standards were rather high. It was not only that I was not very apt, but we were supposed to produce a meal that consisted of 4 different things that would all be cooked at the same minute. And I don't do that kind of cooking now, and neither do my children, neither does anybody I know. On the whole, you either make a stew or you have, say, a meat or a fish or something in a salad that you don't have to mess with. So, but my children know how to do a lot more things. They're especially good at ironing because they have waited many, many weeks to have Mother pick up that iron and do anything for them.
Are any of them interested in writing as a possible career?
My oldest daughter, the one who went to Temple here, writes poetry and has spent the winter this year up north writing. And she's trying to figure out if she can make her living that way. Her other interest is nursery school. But if she teaches nursery school, she doesn't have enough energy left to write. So the others, it's my youngest son, I don't know. He might have some interest in writing. I doubt it on the whole.
You've been interested in humorous writing. What do you think is the key to good humorous writing?
Well, you know, I really never had an abstract interest in humorous writing. When I started writing this conversation between the kid and his father, I just was having fun doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have too much theory about what is humor or isn't, or it's...
Well, I will say this. I laughed out loud in Barry's Goodman when the adolescent boy, Barry's, thought the new maid, Mavis, was actually going to bathe him. I thought that was excellent humorous writing. Was it difficult to produce? Was Barry's a difficult book for you to get?
Barry's was a harder book to write than Cat or than 17th Street Gang because there are many more ideas in it, and it's much harder to get your treatment of an idea and your conclusion of it. I mean, if you're dealing with anti-Semitism, well, you can't take the whole thing in a
Right.
juvenile novel. And you've got to pare down a rather restricted area that you want to deal with, or you get pompous and boring. You know, if you start sermonizing about the whole topic, it's a bore.
In not only Barry's Goodman, but also the 17th Street Gang and Garden of Broken Glass, you do show the warm relationships that develop between young people of different cultural backgrounds, and you have these characters grow and become more enlightened. And you deliberately avoid moralizing, do you?
Yeah, I strongly avoid, because I think you lose your character right away. A person becomes a sort of a cardboard type the minute the author sets up independently, this is what I believe, then your character is just an illustration. He's not a free-moving character who can do what he or she might feel like doing.
Well, in Barry's, those were particularly believable characters. What are some of your present and future writing plans that you can encompass while going to law school?
Well, that's a problem, because I can't encompass any while I'm doing something else. When you're in the middle of writing a book, you usually can think of about 10 other books that you might write when you finish this one. I mean, you know, things come up in one book that obviously you can't expand on there. And you think, gee, that would make a whole separate book. But when you're not writing a book at all, my mind is as blank as anybody else's might be.
Well, thank you very much. Not only did Miss Neville's first book win the Newbery Medal, but her second book, Barry's Goodman, received the Jane Addams Book Award. The latter award is given for the spirit of brotherhood, which is reflected in most of your works. It's been a pleasure having you as our guest.
Thank you.